Welcome to Ink and Insights, where we explore the thinkers and ideas shaping our world today. In this episode, we are joined by Kate Zernike. Kate has been a reporter for the New York Times since 2000. She was a member of the team that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for stories about Al Qaeda before and after the 9/11 terror attacks. Beyond her reporting, Kate is the author of two acclaimed books, Boiling Mad Inside Tea Party America, which explores the rise of the Tea Party movement and the exceptions, Nancy Hopkins, MIT, and the fight for women in science, a powerful account of gender equity battles in academia. In today's episode, we'll dive into her career, her writing, her books, and the broader themes of politics, science, and social change. Kate, welcome to Ink and Insights with Sumit Sharma Shamir.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kate, your role at the New York Times have changed over the years. It's more than 20 years now, especially with shifts in media consumption. How has it changed?
So much. I had dinner last night with a friend who I've worked at the Times for 26 years now. She came 3 years after I did. And, it was really much more, we are just much faster now. Everything is a much faster turnaround, and it's much more about the news. I think, in ye old days, we had much more time to go out, collect a story, think about it, write the story. Editors had more time. It's a 24-hour news cycle. And that was true, of course, when CNN came along, but even more now with the internet. And I think now there's much more emphasis on breaking news because people can the Times is aware, I think, that people can get their information from so many sources that we need to set ourselves apart. So the Times is much more, if you look at the website, it's a puzzle app, it's a cooking app, it's a news app, many different things. Whereas before we were sort of the center show.
Right, right. And you and your colleagues won the Pulitzer Prize in 2002 for reporting on Al Qaeda and the aftermath of 9/11.
Yeah.
What lessons did you take from that coverage, and how do those lessons continue to shape your reporting today?
That's a really interesting question. I think I would say my part of that series was reconstructing the movements of the the 9/11 hijackers in the months leading up to the attacks. But there were my colleagues on that team had been reporting about Al Qaeda. They did a big series on Al Qaeda in January of that year. And they were really, it was sort of seen as this quiet, small obsession on the side. Why are you so obsessed with Al Qaeda? And I think it really is a lesson that often that we don't see the things that are going to be most significant, shape our world the most. And so it really is a reminder of, to look and see what's bubbling up. And I think too often we wait for the stories to be like directly in front of our eyes.
Right, right. And time seems to have completely changed from that, the time when that event took place, and now. How would yourself and your team would have responded had those kind of events taken place now?
Oh, the actual attacks. I mean, I will say when the attacks happened that morning, we were, sent out. Everyone was deployed as a news reporter. So that hasn't changed. I would say it would just be, the Times is a much larger institution now. And it was primarily, reporters. Now it is much more video people, podcast people. We have a live team that does news, immediate news events. And then we have reporters who are sort of going out in the field and taking longer on stories. So I think it would just be much more of a we would send many more people out, particularly to ground zero, which is where in New York City, where the towers collapsed after being struck. I think it would be, we would have a whole team of video and podcast and, reporters down there, and it would be feeding immediately. It wouldn't be like, come back and follow your story by 6 o'clock, which is what it used to be.
Right, right. Let's also talk about your two books, Boiling Mad and the Tea Party and the Exceptions. Let me begin with your first book. What misconceptions about the Tea Party did you want to challenge in Boiling Mad?
Well, again, I think it was, there are times when in a newsroom when people say, oh, you're obsessed with this thing or that thing. I was just fascinated by the rise of this Tea Party, and people were saying to me like, oh, come on, like, is this really a thing? And, I think it seemed to other people like a bunch of cranky, we call them gadflies, right? So people who just like to go to political meetings and complain about things. And certainly there was an element of that. But this was really something. So I was interested in the Tea Party just because I had come back actually from a maternity leave. I'd had my second child. And I came back and I was asked to cover conservatives in America. I'd covered the Sarah Palin vice presidential campaign. And so I just kept hearing people talking about the Tea Party and not reporter friends, but people I was talking to in interviews. And so I finally went to a meeting organized by a Tea Party group in a place called Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is a pretty ordinary American suburban district. It's always one of those places where Democrats and Republicans are fighting to gain control and to choose the member of Congress. And I was just shocked. There were 8 people running for Congress. A bunch of them were Tea Party. They were all seeking the local Tea Party group's approval. And then I met the person who was arranging it. And it was this woman who was, she also had 2 small children. She had been a TV reporter before that. And I was just really struck by, she and the other people I met, I was really struck by this sort of very American quality of it. Like, we can change politics. We can change the world. And there's nothing particularly American about that, except that I do think Americans are imbued with a certain confidence. And it was just sort of like they had no question that they could go out and be leaders of this new movement. And that was really fascinating to me, that just the sheer confidence of it all. And they were really angry. They felt betrayed. And I think it started out as a fairly generic tax revolt. We don't want our taxes to be so high. Why are they raising our taxes? Why are we paying money so that other people don't have to pay their mortgages or whatever it was, or don't have to, pay their bank loans back, their student loans back? And then it became much more. And what was also interesting to me about it was that for a long time, I had written about culture wars in America, over education or abortion. And the Tea Party was very much saying, like, we don't care about all that anymore. We want we want the country to be functional again. We want our government in Washington to be functional. But after they came into power, and they really did, so that was in late 2009. And by the next year, they had really reshaped the government. They swept the midterm elections. Obama, who was in his first term then, very famously got up and said, we had a shellacking last night. Like, they really beat the Democrats. And I think if you look at the Republican Party today and the rise of Trump, it really was this Tea Party movement that gave rise to Trump. And it was this sense of sort of the ordinary people who could come in and say, no, you politicians in Washington, we're not leaving it to you anymore. We're in control here. This whole idea of taking back America.
Right. I think partly you have responded, but I was about to ask, how did the Tea Party influence the Republican Party's trajectory?
I think it was very much, it really, if you look at the Republican Party now, it's very much a Tea Party Republican Party. You have to remember that whatever, 50 years ago, the Republican Party, or maybe not 50, but certainly a century ago, the Republican Party had been the anti-slavery party, right? They were the party of Black Americans. And so that's completely changed. But I think going into the Tea Party years, the Republican Party was sort of, it was a little more genteel. It was truly conservative and like, let's not raise our taxes and let's be business friendly. And I think that the Tea Party movement wanted all that, but they also wanted a much rougher politics. They were like, very much more like what we think of today as the MAGA Republicans, right? Like, very loud, very much seizing things back. If you look at, I'm not saying that the Tea Partiers weren't necessarily the ones who raided the Capitol, but I think it was that raw energy of this feeling of like, almost physically, we want to take back our country.
Right. And do you see parallels between the Tea Party and current populist movements?
Oh, yeah. I think, for a time there was the, sort of the 99% movement in this country, which is, the 99% meaning the not super rich people. And they certainly shared some things in common with the Tea Party, which was primarily the idea that the government isn't working for us. Obviously, the Tea Party became much more, and again, I don't think this is everyone, but it became much more infused with racial politics, anti-abortion politics, whereas the initial people in the Tea Party, what they really wanted to do was to keep the cultural politics out of it. But if you looked, the Times did a really interesting, we developed a poll when I was covering the Tea Party, and we looked at the values. And one of the things they said was Black people have, I'm paraphrasing the question badly, but it was something along the lines of Black people have been given too many benefits. Like it's, this whole idea, this sort of liberal idea that we need to make reparations for slavery, or it's at least, that Black people have been discriminated against for years, and therefore it is right to do affirmative action. The Tea Party very much felt like, no, we have now bent over backwards, and that is hurting us. It's taking money away from us, from people who've worked really hard to earn what they've got.
Right. Kate, and your another book, The Exceptions and the Women in Science, is centered around Nancy Hopkins.
Yeah.
What drew you to Nancy Hopkins' story as the centerpiece of The Exceptions?
Oh my goodness. Well, I always say that my father was a physicist. My grandfather was a physicist. That whole side of the family were mathematicians and physicists. And my dad, I began covering higher education for the Boston Globe in September of 1998. And my dad had just come back from an American Physical Society meeting, and he said, you should look up the work that this woman named Millie Dresselhaus is doing to get more women into physics. And I completely ignored him, as children do. But 6 months later, someone came to me, a tip came in the newsroom that there was something going on with women and discrimination at MIT. And I should call this woman Nancy Hopkins. And I thought it'll be a lawsuit of some kind. But when I called, Nancy said, in fact, the president of MIT is going to admit that MIT discriminated against the women on its science faculty. And I was like, wow, that's unusual. And really brave. And aren't they worried about lawsuits? And I went over and Nancy gave me this report, and it was the women on the science faculty had very methodically, very scientifically gathered all this data to show how they were discriminated against, how they were shortchanged compared to men, which to me was almost funny. I liked that they had leaned into their scientific instincts. And then I went and I met with Nancy, and I said, well, how did this all start? And she said, well, I needed more space for my zebrafish tank. She's a cancer researcher. And I couldn't get more space, even though I knew the men had more space than I did. And I said, well, how did you know the men had more space? And she said, well, I measured. And I was like, measured? And she said, with a tape measure, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And indeed, she had gotten down on her hands and knees late at night and measured all the space in the building and figured out that she had less space than she had tenure at the time. And she'd been on the faculty for 20 years. And men without tenure had more space than she did. So it was just sort of the story of ingenuity that I really admired about these women. And Nancy is, so that was in 1999 when I broke that story for the Boston Globe. And I kept in touch with Nancy, and I came back to the story 20 years later, partly because I was reflecting on the Me Too movement and, really obviously the Me Too movement was much more egregious sexual assault in most cases. But I was looking at what these women had pointed out, which was much more subtle discrimination, sort of like, being kept out of decisions and being marginalized, kept out of just conversations, really. And I thought, well, that problem is underlying all of this Me Too stuff, and we're not talking about that. So this could be this book could help people understand what the problem is underlying all of this disrespect of women. And Nancy, the more I looked into it, I started out thinking I was going to write a book about these 16 women because I'd really admired what they had done as a group, the women who come together at MIT. And I should say that when I did this story in 1999, the women had found that on the faculty at the School of Science at MIT, there were 197 men with tenure and only 15 women, which is really an astonishing 8%. I mean, in 1999, that's crazy. And in many departments, biology and chemistry in particular, the number of undergraduates was well over 50%. So it wasn't that women weren't interested in science. So when I came back to do the book, Nancy was the one who'd been the spokesperson for this because she was willing to be the spokesperson. But when I came back to do the book and I looked into her story, I realized that she really had been on the cusp of so much of this. When she was a student at Harvard, or Radcliffe, I should say, which was the girls' wing of Harvard, she had been just before the second wave feminist movement. And she really had a skepticism of feminism that I think a lot of women her age had, but I think that repeats itself in younger generations. I think if you talk to some young women today, they'll say, well, I'm not a feminist, but, and I think that was probably who I was. It was like, well, I don't need that, but I do believe in women's rights, but I'm not a feminist. which is kind of a crazy thing to say, but we had all been taught that feminism was something bad, something ugly, something mean or disrespectful.
तिमीसँग अब धेरै टाइम छैन है, बिहे गर्नु छ भने गरिहाल, नत्र घरबाट मलाई अन्तै बिहे गर्दिनु।
भर्खर 3 वर्ष भयो एमबीबीएस जोइन गरेको, 5 वर्षको कोर्स हो। के भो? अचम्म छ। एक्सक्यूज मी सर मेरो 5 वर्षको कोर्स 3 वर्षमा सकाउन मिल्दैन?
गेट आउट।
हेलो,
के सोच्यो त?
के सोच्ने? मैले प्रिन्सिपलसँग पनि कुरा गरिसके। 3 वर्षमा पनि के हुन्छ? के हुन्छ 3 वर्षमा?
के भयो भाइ? ल बस। साउजी एक कप चिया। कसले भन्यो 3 वर्षमा के हुँदैन भनेर? यो हेर, एलआईसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजनामा 3 वर्षमा पैसा फिर्ता हुन्छ।
ए हो र?
जीवन बीमाको साथमा धनवृष्टि 3 वर्षमा एलआईसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजना। एलआईसी नेपाल।
And how did the MIT gender equity study become a turning point in academia?
I think a couple of reasons. There had been many. So MIT, as I said, all these women got together and did this study where they gathered data and stories about their experiences. And they never expected, first of all, they didn't know it would go public. I was the one who made it public. And they thought that this was a problem just at MIT. But the reality was many different universities had done similar studies over the years, and they'd generally been shelved. I think what made a difference was, first and foremost, that the president of MIT stood up and said, this is happening and this is wrong. And he had this great line, which was quoted in every news story about it. And he said, I've always believed that something like contemporary gender discrimination in academia is part perception and part reality. True, but I now recognize that reality is the greater part of the balance. And that statement was so short and so powerful coming from him. Here he was, this engineer, traditionally male field. He was saying, no, this is real. So it was partly that Chuck Vest was the president. It was partly that MIT was so prestigious and had this big name. I think had it been, even the University of Kentucky, which is a very good school, I think it would have been like, well, it's just, one state school. And I think it was just, the fact that these women had done this work. They were an inspiring story. But so MIT really, so my story ran and so I worked at the Boston Globe at the time. We put it on the front page. 2 days later, the New York Times put it on the front page. And this is really, it's not pre-internet, but it's pre-news on internet. So there was it wasn't like people could hit an email this story. At the time, you had to sort of copy the link or whatever and send it. And people really, I always say that women around the country and around the world were saying, this is my story. And I thought I was the only one. And it was this recognition. I think it was this recognition that these women had the same experience, but it was also that Nancy had taken this tape measure. It was that they had data. But really within MIT, what had been so powerful was telling the stories of the women.
Absolutely. And Kate, did reporting this book change how you view your own profession as a woman in journalism?
I think it did. And in some ways, I won't say it was sad, but it's definitely a reflective experience. There was one chapter in particular where Nancy, it's sort of the straw that breaks Nancy's back. And I felt very much as I was writing that chapter, I had a painful experience myself where I felt like something was taken away from me unfairly in my career. And looking back, I realized, of course, it was, they thought that I was this because I was a woman. They thought I couldn't do this because I had children. And that they were making an assumption about me that was wrong. And there was nothing I could do about that, just because that was the way culture was, right? And it's not even so much the fault of other people. It's that other people like us, we're all shaped by cultural attitudes. So that was, it just really made me think about my own career and the effect of children. It also made me think about all the things that I wish I'd done differently, things where I wish I had been more persistent, because maybe women have to be a little more persistent, and places where I felt misunderstood and I thought it was sort of a personal thing. And in fact, it was a gender thing. It also reminded me that, from a very logistical point, like when you get a new job, you have to ask for a raise because they're not automatically going to give that to you. I think sometimes it is the assumption with men, because it's all the way it's always been. The workplace is still getting used to amazingly enough, a half century later, the workplace is still getting used to the idea of equal pay for women and that women are the same in the workplace or should be treated the same.
Right. Kate, you have a very long career in journalism in United States, with stemmed internationally recognized papers, and you might have seen your role evolve as well. But how difficult it is to work in today's context in the given political polarization shaping American society right now?
Well, I think there are all the obvious ways in that it has become, we have training into, how to report during a riot, how to report in a crowd that goes crazy on you, political protests. So there's a greater current of violence. There is certainly less respect. I saw a study again this week, certainly less respect for journalists. I think we are now, of all the establishments in the United States, we are the least respected. That's hard to take. That's embarrassing and hard to take and sad to me, because I see my colleagues doing amazing work and I know the kind of spirit that they bring to it and the spirit of honesty and integrity. But I think also in smaller ways that maybe the public wouldn't recognize, which is that, well, I'll say, for example, when I was covering the Sarah Palin campaign, after that she wrote a book when I was covering the Tea Party, and I went out and talked to people at some of her book events, and people were lining up to buy her book. And I remember I was taking notes, talking to someone, two women, and at the end I asked for their name and we spelled them and everything. And one of the women said to me, "Now, where did you say you're from?" And I said, "The New York Times." And she literally grabbed my notebook out of my hand and said, "Oh my God, my husband would kill me for talking to you." And I had to struggle to get the notebook back because there was such antipathy toward the New York Times. So that was shocking at the time, but now it's like, oh, that was so mild, because like I worry about physical violence now, not with every story, but people are we are suspect to them. But in more subtle ways. So, for instance, I was just talking to a colleague yesterday, and he just texted me while we're talking, so it's reminding me of it. He asked me to introduce himself to a state official who I met years ago because he wanted to do a story. And he was doing a lighthearted story about the World Cup in New Jersey. And this person, the official who he spoke to, didn't want to talk on the phone, didn't want to talk in person, wanted the question to be written and emailed first, and she would email back a statement. And the statement she emailed back was very neutral. And I think people are afraid to talk. People are afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so it feels like a less, I don't want to say less honest experience, but less fresh experience, much more manipulated. And to that end, we also have to, or to that same point, we also have to worry about, I used to get a recording of something and say like, oh, this is a recording of a meeting. Of course, this is what happened. I have a physical copy of this is, Now it's like, unless I see it with my own eyes, I don't know that it's not a deep fake. So it's really hard. There are a lot more questions. You have to be a lot more careful.
True. Kate, and what does declining trust in institutions like newspapers mean for democracy?
I guess what I really admired about newspapers, and the reason that I wanted to get into journalism, was that I felt as a young person in my teens, really, that I turned to newspapers to understand the world. And so the idea that I could help other people understand the world felt like such an honor and a privilege and a gift. Like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I really took it seriously, and I wanted to be this was my way of being part of society. I was raised in a family, my parents did they weren't politicians, but they did local volunteer things, and they were always very involved, and it was very important to be an active citizen. And this was my way of being an active citizen. And now the idea that like, we're just dismissed is sad and embarrassing. And I think I wonder, but you see it happening, as media gets fractured and people, my own children who are teenagers, they get some of their news on Instagram and some from TikTok and some from videos on YouTube from content providers who I've never even heard of. And I look, and it seems like, they're often, they look at history channels on YouTube quite frequently, or history content providers. And they're interesting, and from what I can tell, they're truthful. But what do I know? I haven't done the research firsthand myself. So I think it's hard when we are all looking for and finding our own version of reality to have an honest conversation. And the conversation is happening in so many different pockets. I just think it's very fractured, and it's very hard to have a common sense of purpose. You look at, so my husband's are Knicks fans, right? And the Knicks just won the NBA finals. And it was this amazing moment in New York City when, you actually heard the city come alive, right? That people were unified around this thing. And that is so rare these days. We saw that in COVID, everybody, for the first few days, it might be unifying because we were all in this together and we were all but very quickly that fell apart. And it was people had their own reality, their own pods of people, their own pods of what they believe, their own version of science. That to me is really troubling and really difficult. I don't know how we bounce back from that.
Right. And I completely could relate to what you were saying, because it's not only confined within the United States, but it's kind of trend in most of the countries.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. But have the grassroots movements, evolved since the Tea Party era in US right now?
I would say that certainly what was interesting is after Trump got elected, first we had the women's marches, and then there was this movement to sort of push back on Trump. And initially they were calling themselves the Resistance. And then one of the groups in particular that grew up around it was called Indivisible. And I think one of the reasons that they became most organized is that they really looked at the Tea Party movement as a model, and they wanted to be a liberal, a democratic version of the Tea Party movement. Of course, that was kind of funny to me, because when I talked to the Tea Party movement people in 2009, 2010, they were all saying, we are taking a playbook from Saul Alinsky and the radical left about organizing and flooding people, like flooding the town hall. So I do think that certainly now this whole idea of, one of the things that the Tea Parties, when members of Congress went home to their local districts that summer to talk about proposed healthcare plan, the Tea Party movement had this thing called flooding the halls. And so they would just send these crowds of people into these meetings with the members of Congress to complain and to be very loud. And the idea was be loud, get noticed. And so I do think that has shaped popular movements now, for sure. So I think that spirit is still there, this idea that we can shape, we can shape the debate. And in some ways, what I worry more about is people just becoming apathetic and like, well, there's nothing we can do. What's the point? I was very encouraged the night that the first assassination attempt on Trump in July of 2024, I had a group of teenage boys here with my son. And their first response was, how can you adults have left us with these two basically 80-something-year-old men? Like, why are we choosing between these two old guys? Like, you guys have made such a mess of things. And now, like, Trump might, someone tried to take Trump's life, and we have Biden who's old. But very quickly, one of them said, I want to run for office someday. And he said, this is inspiring me to run for office. So I do think that there is a young optimism, and that's encouraging to see.
That's very encouraging, Kate. What trends do you see shaping the next decade of American politics?
Really good question. I still think we're very much in this populist movement, and that there is still, people like to say, oh, the country's going left or going right. I think the country is just pushing out who's ever in office. I think the trends that I see are the issues that are shaping politics. I think affordability is obviously the biggest issue, but I think on that, it's housing. I just did this, maybe I'm thinking about this because I just did a story about young politicians who are shaping the housing debate, but that's actually really going to change the landscape of cities and towns in this country, because there is this sense that housing has become too expensive. We need to reshape our cities to make room for more people. So that's something. I do think that young people are pressing for much more of a voice. I just think there's a generational shift going on, and we're going to see a departure of a lot of people who've been on the stage for a long time. We already have that, Nancy Pelosi is retiring, but I think you're going to see increasingly, there is a big movement of young people pushing out the older generation. And I think the country's going to have to sort through not only a change in age, but how we feel about race. I think, healthcare is changing. The debate, certainly the affordability of healthcare. So I think in general, it's going to be generational change, and that the next generation has a much greater sense of possibility. Why isn't the government helping us with healthcare? I mean, we're seeing it's just a much more liberal generation. Part of that was also shaped by another beat that I covered, which is abortion, because, famously in 2022, the Supreme Court of the United States overturned Roe v. Wade, which for 50 years had established a right to abortion in this country. And that, I think initially we thought that there were a lot of people who thought of themselves as anti-abortion because they were pro-life. And what they realized when abortion was taken away in many states was that, oh no, actually abortion is a medical procedure, and we do want women to have access to this. So views on that have changed. And I think that has really, the taking away of abortion rights has really pushed a lot of young women in particular much more to the left. And if you look at the youngest generation of voters, the 18 to 29-year-olds, they are much more liberal than women of my generation or even the generations in between. So I think that's going to change things as well.
Right, Kate. And how important or decisive would be the foreign policy factors that would be, shaping the American politics?
I think it's huge. Partly because foreign policy is not just, on our battlefields, of course, anymore, or right. It's in the climate, right? And the younger generation really cares about that. So I think this country, I don't know where this struggle is going, but I do think this country is having a struggle between, isolationism and and the sense of needing to take care of the rest of the world. But I just think that, I'm very curious to see how this war in the Middle East is going to shape things, because I think to a lot of young people, it looks like, why are we there? I think certainly, Israeli politics of Israel and Palestine have really, the younger generation does not have that sense of connection to, for the most part, they don't have that sense of connection to, they obviously understand the Holocaust. I want to be careful here, but I think they don't understand. They look at it in many cases when I talk to young people as, well, but how do you justify this genocide because of a previous genocide? You don't use one to justify another. And this whole idea of, never forget means something different to them than it does to a lot of perhaps older people who felt that Israel, when you talk to young people, there's this sense that the older generation has said to Israel, do whatever you want because of the Holocaust. And the younger generation doesn't understand that. And again, right. That's not a universal. When I speak, I'm always worried about speaking in journalism. And one of the things I love about journalism is that we can find nuance. One of the things I worry about with journalism is that it's harder and harder as news becomes faster and faster to get that nuance.
Exactly.
And the nuance, I think, is the nuance, when you read a good news story and it recognizes the nuance, I think that brings people into journalism and makes people trust journalism and think like, oh yes, they're really trying to understand this. And I worry now with things so fast that we alienate more and more people.
In fact, that was my last question. You have partly responded to it. Yeah. Kate, my last question for today's program is, what can journalists do to rebuild trust with audiences who have felt alienated?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's the same thing when you think about rebuilding trust in any relationship, right? It's really listening. It's really, it's recognizing that you hear people, you see people, and that you're not there with an agenda, that you really are interested in what they think of. I always say, it's funny, empathy, I think at some point Elon Musk said something, empathy is for the weak or something. I think empathy and compassion are huge for anyone, for all of us. But certainly in journalism, I think it's really like you can never stop trying to understand. And there's this whole idea in journalism, and young journalists love to talk about this when I speak to journalism classes or schools. They talk about objectivity, right? How can you be truly objective? And I always say the reality is you can't be truly objective, because simply just the choice to do one story and not do another story, just the choice of talking to you and not talking to someone else, that is, I am making a choice, and someone is going to take a point of view from that. But the way you get around that is really to do your best, to strive as hard as you can to understand all the sides that you see out there, not both sides, but all the different nuances, all the shades of gray. To me, that's what's exciting. It's what makes journalism interesting. And It's what makes stories. So many stories are cyclical. I covered education, and so many issues in education come up each time, but there's always some little small difference, right? That this generation has brought to it, or this moment has brought to it. And that's the really interesting and cool and exciting part about journalism. And I think that's what journalists should look for their own sake, because it makes the work more interesting, but also because then you get to true understanding. And I think if people can see, oh yes, this person is really trying to understand and acknowledging what she doesn't know as well as what she has observed, I think that can go a long way.
Kate, empathy and compassion. I'll take those two words to wind up our conversation.
They're really important.
But thank you so much for your time. It was great talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me.